This is Bitnar Talks, the engineer takes on construction. Episode 19. Hi, I'm Piotr Bitnar. Each day I help my clients plan and design building projects through Bitnar Limited, a consulting chartered structural engineer's practice. My biggest passion and the cornerstone on which I've built my business is finding clever solutions for construction projects. I am a chartered structural engineer and a budding software developer, so you can rest assured that I will strive to talk about the best practices and the use of new technologies in the industry. And if you're embarking on a construction project or are involved in planning, designing and building the world around us, you'll find this podcast useful. Approved Document B, Fire Safety, Volume 2, Part 2. Hi there, and welcome back to Bitnar Talks, your favorite podcast on all matters of architecture, engineering and construction. It is Thursday the 6th of June 2024, and I'm here back with you with the 19th episode and further information on fire safety in buildings other than dwellings. Today, I will finalize talking about the Approved Document B, Fire Safety, Volume 2. Last week, in episode 18, I introduced you to the requirements of the approved document and introduced you to the subject of warning and escape, as well as the fire spread through internal linings. So the requirements B1 and B2, covering sections 0 to 6. In general, I told you that the Volume 2 of the Approved Document B offers fire safety guidance for non-dwelling buildings, focusing on life safety over property protection, and assuming proper management practices by building owners. It includes considerations for inclusivity, alternative safety approaches, and special provisions for specific buildings types like healthcare and historical buildings. Buildings are categorized into 6 purpose groups for risk assessment, with stringent measures applied to mixed-use buildings and complex situations, potentially requiring fire safety engineering. Key requirements include adequate early fire warning systems, safe escape routes, and reliable fire detection systems, alongside provisions for horizontal and vertical escape and special rules for small premises. The document also mandates that internal linings resist flame spread and manage heat release, ensuring adherence to essential fire safety standards. In this episode, I will cover requirements B3 to B5 and Regulation 38. So without further ado, let's dive into the fire safety as treated in the approved document. Today, I will talk about the guidance on provision of enough fire protection, separation, smoke and heat control, and provision of enough facilities to enable firefighters to successfully undergo fire and rescue operations in the buildings other than dwellings. In this material, we will concentrate on the differences between the previous guidance seen in Volume 1, considering flats. I will not reiterate the previous episode, but extend on that knowledge or augment it in line with the requirement of Volume 2, requirements B3 to B5. Alright, so let's dive straight into it, shall we? So let's start with requirement B3, internal fire spread structure. The building shall be designed and constructed so that in the event of fire, its stability will be maintained for a reasonable period. A wall common to 2 or more buildings shall be designed and constructed so that it adequately resists the spread of fire between those buildings. For the purpose of this subparagraph, a house in a terrace and a semi-detached house are each to be treated as a separate building. Where reasonably necessary to inhibit the spread of fire within the building, measures shall be taken to an extent appropriate to the size and intended use of the building, comprising either or both of the following: A. Subdivision of the building with fire-resisting construction. B. Installation of suitable automatic fire suppression systems. And point 4, the building shall be designed and constructed so that the unseen spread of fire and smoke within the concealed spaces in its structure and fabric is inhibited. So simple. In a gist, the amount of consideration due will depend on the purpose group classification and the element considered, but in any case, the building's structure needs to withstand the event of fire for a prescribed time without losing its stability. The building should be compartmentalized to restrain the event of fire, including openings. Automatic suppression systems should be introduced where needed, and unseen spaces and cavities should be compartmentalized also to inhibit the spread of concealed fires and smoke. So starting with section 7, load-bearing elements of structure. Most of the information on fire resistance is contained within Appendix B, including some special provisions like the one of single-story buildings that by their nature may not need any fire protection unless they support a compartment structure. In such cases, they need the protection of the same rate as of that compartment. Let's start with what is considered as an element of structure and what is not. In simple terms, all that allows the building to stand and carry the envelope load and people at certain height is the element of structure. All the rest is not. Things like roofs, platform floors, lowest floor of the building, stage grids, loading gallery, curtain walls, and so on are not considered elements of structure. An additional consideration for raised storage areas is mentioned in that section also, in circumstances where building does not otherwise need protection. So single-story storage building, which by virtue of raised area could become two-story. Section 8 deals with compartmentation and sprinklers. Walls and floors separating buildings of different uses should be compartment walls, unless the different use is ancillary to the main use. Stairs or service shaft connecting different compartments should be protected to restrict the spread of fire. In any case of special fire hazard places, these places should be enclosed with minimum of Ray-Ferry construction. In general, the lowest floor in the building does not need to be a compartment floor, but for the residential institutional, including healthcare buildings and residential other buildings. In non-residential buildings, the consideration for compartmentalization follows the consideration of the floor area and height of the top story above or below the ground level. Starting with no limits on compartmentation by floors for buildings with floors up to 30 meters above ground level and basements up to 10 meters below ground level. But naturally, basement needs to be separated from the top structure by fire-resistant floor. Buildings over this limit will need to have compartment floors. When it comes to the horizontal division, offices and car parks have no limits to the size of their compartments, and otherwise the size varies between 2,000 square meters in unsprinkled shops and up to 40,000 meters in sprinklered storage and other non-residential buildings. Sprinklers are generally required in buildings with top story over 30 meters up in the air. In respect of the compartmentation walls and floors, this should form a complete barrier and be of appropriate grade. Masonry compartment walls may be bridged by structural members, but the penetration needs to be as small as possible. Fire stopped, and the failure of structure on one side of the wall should not lead to the failure on the other side. Special consideration may be needed for services that could be a source of ignition. Compartment walls between buildings or separating parts of building need to extend the full height of the building in one vertical plane. Other compartment walls need to extend a full story. In general, compartment walls at the top story should be taken through the roof space. Junction between the compartment elements or external wall should be integral and fire stopped. In case the external wall has no fire resistance, it should be attached to the floor to avoid flying off, as the phoenix rising from the ashes, spreading the fire in the close vicinity. Compartment walls need to be able to maintain integrity even if the floor deflects due to the fire. Guidance even gives assumption to what level of deflection is appropriate, at 40 mm midspan of the floor. Compartment wall junctions with the roof are treated in the same way as for dwellings, but the relaxation of the substrate classification that traverses the junction to the lower class is only possible in some buildings and under 50 meters in height. Allowance for openings in compartment walls separating buildings or occupancies is given for the passage of pipes and fire doors. The fire doors need to be of the same fire resistance as that of the wall, and it needs to provide means of escape. In other compartment walls or floors, the provision of appropriate fire doors, pipe vents, refuse chutes, protected shafts and atria is possible following guidance. Protected shaft made for whatever reason, stairs, lift ducts, chutes or other, should be of the construction that prevents spread of fire between compartments it traverses, and itself be of appropriate build to resist fire. Be properly ventilated too. A glazed screen can be provided between the stair and lobby or corridor, provided the enclosure is not more than Ray 60 and the glazing screen is E30 and complies with the dimensions restrictions, and the corridor or lobby is minimum Ray 30 and closed. Otherwise, the guidance refers us to appropriate tables in Appendix B. There are provisions for oil and gas pipes, as well as the ventilation ducts in protected shafts, and these need to be either separated from the shaft of certain material or serving the shaft only. In addition, if the pipe is conveying flammable gas, the shaft needs to be top-bottom ventilated. External walls of protected shafts do not usually need to be fire-rated unless otherwise required by the virtue of its use, like a firefighting shaft or a protected stairway. Other openings in the protected shaft follow the consideration of similar penetrations as of that in compartment walls. Off to Section 9, Cavities. The provision of the guidance on cavities follows that of the Volume 1 for flats, but extends ever so slightly, with the requirements of openings in cavity barriers provided over and under not fire-rated partitions in residential buildings need to be kept to a minimum, and any penetration should be smoke-stopped, and there is otherwise no more requirements for this, as would be the case with cavity barriers that extend on the compartmentation. Cavity barriers forming parts of compartmentation have their rules, but there is otherwise possibility of many large hidden spaces without such compartmentation, and these are ruled by maximum dimensions depending on the material class of the enclosure that is exposed within the cavity. So for cavities between the ceiling and the roof, the maximum dimension is 20 meter, no matter what the material. But for other cavities, it is either 20 meter for materials class C and beta, and 10 meter of all lower classes. There are some exceptions from these rules, like fully fitted cavities of cavity walls, overcladding with material better than class BS3D2, and others. And that's it on cavities. All of the rest is same as for the flats. Section 10 directs us to protection of openings and fire stopping. Provisions are generally the same as that found in the information provided for dwellings, but guidance is a tad more strict on the material and size of penetrations of pipes through fire separating elements. And there is a section that deals with situations where there is a risk of people slipping in. In this case, appropriate arrangement for the activation of fire and smoke dampers should be in place. For Section 11, special provisions for car parks. That's an additional section that's otherwise not in the Volume 1. So in this document, extra information is provided on the considerations for car parks, distinguishing between the ones that are open to the sides and ones that are closed. It is considered that we know at what intensity the cars burn and that the risk of fire spreading between stories is little in well-vented spaces, so dependent on ventilation, the different circumstances. The open-sided car park is the car park with no basements, naturally ventilated at each level meaning at least 5% of the floor area is ventilation area to the sides, but at least 1.25% of the floor area in opposite sides. Cross ventilation. All materials should be A1 rated, except for floors and roofs, and some leeway is provided on small facilities or areas immediately adjacent to it, like things like fire dorsets and alike. Naturally, the array for the car park structural elements needs to be at the level matching that for the supporting compartment, if greater than that for the consideration of the car park alone. Otherwise, consideration starts at 15 minutes, which may allow some steel structure members to remain without protection. For close-sided car parks, the fire resistance needs to be between 30 and 120 minutes for structural elements. If there is at least 2.5% opening to the outside, of which at least 0.625%, so nearly a little bit more than 0.5%, is in opposite ends, the car park is considered naturally ventilated. Otherwise, it will require mechanical ventilation. Mechanical ventilation needs to be separated for the car park and capable to achieve 10 air changes per hour during fire and be separated into two parts. So when one fails, there is a residual 50% capacity in the system and capable to work off-grid, meaning with its own power supply. Outlets should be equally spread at high and low levels. In addition, the guidance directs us to British standards for the quality of ducting and type of system. So British standard 1366 for fire resistant tests for service installations, British standard 12101 smoke and heat control system, and BS 7346 for components for smoke control systems. And that's it for requirement B3. Moving on to requirement B4, external fire spread. Let's start with a little bit of the legislation. There's only 2 paragraphs in that requirement, but an addition of regulation 7 is put in place, and that one's quite long regarding materials and workmanship. So let's start with requirement B4, paragraph 1. The external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another, having regard to the height, use, and position of that building. The roof of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the roof and from one building to another, having regard to the use and position of the building. Regulation 7, which goes on to treat about materials and workmanship. Paragraph 1. Building work shall be carried out with adequate proper materials which I. Are appropriate for the circumstances in which they are used, I. Are adequately mixed or prepared, and I. Are applied, used or fixed so as adequately to perform the function for which they are designed, and in a workmanlike manner. 1a. Building work shall be carried out so that the relevant metal composite material does not become part of an external wall or specified attachment of any building. 2. Subject to paragraph 3, building work shall be carried out so that materials which become part of an external wall or specified attachment of a relevant building, and I highlight here relevant building, are of European classification A2, S1, D0 or A1, classified in accordance with the reaction to fire classification. Paragraph 3. Paragraph 2 does not apply to, and adds a long list now, A. Cavity trays when used between 2 leaves of masonry. B. Any part of roof other than any part of a roof which falls within paragraph 4 of regulation 2.6 if that part is connected to an external wall, which basically means slanted walls up to 70 degrees. C. Door frames and doors. D. Electrical installations. D. A. Fiber optic cables. E. Insulation and waterproofing materials used below ground level or up to 300 millimeters above the level. F. Intumescent and fire-stopping materials where the inclusion of the materials is necessary to meet the requirements of Part B of Schedule 1. G. Membranes, H. Seals, gaskets, fixings, sealants and bucker rods. J. Components associated with the solar shading devices, excluding components whose primary function is to provide shade or deflect sunlight, such as the awning curtain or slats. I. Thermal break materials where the inclusion of the material is necessary to meet the thermal bridging requirements of Part L of Schedule 1. J. Window frames and glass. Or K. Materials which form the top horizontal floor layer of a balcony, which are of European classification A1 floor or A2 floor S1, classified in accordance with the reaction to fire classification, provided that the entire layer has an imperforated substrate under it. Paragraph 4. In this regulation, a relevant building means a building with a story not including rooftop plant areas or any story consisting exclusively of plant rooms at least 80 meters above ground level, and which I. contains one or more dwellings, I. contains an institution, or I. contains a room for residential purposes, and B. above ground level in relation to a story means above ground level when measured from the lowest ground level adjoining the outside of a building to the top of the floor surface of the story. Well, that was quite a bit, wasn't it? So you see in the gist, it is simple, but has a lot of flavor in terms of exclusions. If you listen to the episode treating on this requirement, you are pretty much covered, as most of the approach is universal, and you are cordially invited to go and listen to episode 16. Now, section 12, resisting fire spread over external walls. There are material use restrictions that relate to the external surface starting at A2 or better for relevant buildings and close to the boundary, to C for buildings other than residential and assembly and recreational. An additional consideration for the overcladding of masonry walls or cavity wall construction with solid inner leaf construction in terms of its build-up is put in place and it requires the inner side of the overcladding or the external leaf, if you like. It needs to be of a sandwich type, meaning the inner side needs to match the outside in terms of performance. All the remaining aspects follow the guidance you can find in volume 1 of the approved document. It's all about the internal surface not catching fire, not being more sustainable to catching fire to that is outside. In section 13, resisting fire spread from one building to another, again, it is nearly entirely covered in volume 1, but some additional information you can find, like in the case of large uncompartmented buildings, when considering unprotected areas, the areas over 30 meters above the mean ground level do not need to be taken in consideration. And two approaches covered in BS 999 are the alternative approaches, but guidance for atria is the one especially recognized in the document. Section 14, resisting fire spread over roof covering. I like how quickly we go through these points, don't you? If you recall the previous episodes, it was not that easy, so do go back to revise, as these expectations are the same and applicable here also. There is nothing new to add to this section that is different from volume 1. So that's last section to discharge requirement B4. Now off to requirement B5. Access and facilities for the fire service. Point 1. The building shall be designed and constructed so as to provide reasonable facilities to assist firefighters in the protection of life. 2. Reasonable provision shall be made within the site of the building to enable fire appliances to gain access to the building. So simple again. And it is, if you think about the reason behind it, which is provision of enough access to allow for the fire and rescue operation, most of the consideration of this is your safety at the time of emergency, so may seem obsolete until they're not. Few points here. There needs to be enough external access to enable fire appliances to be used. Here this may vary depending on the location, so speak to your local fire rescue service to find out more. enough access to the building is to be provided, enough access to internal fire facilities too, and enough ventilation for heat and smoke to facilitate that access and operation. And that's it. Let's see what the section's got to say. Section 15 deals with vehicle access. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do to provide enough access for typical firefighting brigade with all their kit? It all starts with typical consideration already covered in Volume 1 of the document B. So I will not reiterate this, but will concentrate on differences. The base of all consideration is the reach of typical firefighting appliances in the face of the building of a given size, height, and whether firemen are fitted or not. Starting with no fireman's mains building, the requirement starts at 45 meters, but is limited to 15% of the perimeter of the building up to 2,000 meters squared, with the highest floor up to 11 meters above ground level, and goes up to 100% of the perimeter of the building over 24,000 meters squared, and over 11 meter height limit. Under 11 meter floors reached by pumps, and over 11 meters by high reach appliances. The floor area is the sum of all stories not including basements. Perimeter calculation excludes walls in common with other buildings, but includes projections of stories over. For fire mains, there is 80 meter distance limit to inlets or outlets, either externally for inlets of dry mains or of the entry point to the wet main, but are also subject to consideration of section 16 and 17. Access routes and hard standings requirement is bound to the side of the building and have the same considerations as the one for dwellings. Additional considerations are given to space adjacent to the hard standing to allow operation of turntable ladders or hydraulic platforms. Section 16, firemans and hydrants, follow the same provision of Volume 1 of the approved documents. Section 17, access to buildings for firefighting personnel, is a little bit extended. In this section is also covered in Volume 1. However, the special provisions for floods do not apply. Things like firefighting shafts incorporate all elements of the escape route, including lobby, lifts and stairway, encapsulating all three with Ray 120 construction. In addition, the guidance recognizes that the need for the provision of at least 2 firefighting shafts for buildings under the 80 meter floor level height bracket, when that building is a shop and commercial, assembly and recreational, or industrial purposes group building, group 4, 5 and 6, and when they have at least 1 story at a level higher than 7.5 meters over the fire rescue access level. The story area consideration remains limited to 900 meters square plus. Section 18. Venting of heat and smoke from basements. Venting of heat and smoke from basement follows the same consideration of the Volume 1, so I would like to return you back to the episode 17 of this podcast, but when there is a basement car park, the ventilation consideration discussed in Section 11 is sufficient. And that's done for the regulations, for the requirements B. Let's mention the Regulation 38 in the letter of law, which is Fire Safety Information Regulation 38. Point 1. This regulation applies where building work A consists of or includes the erection or extension of a relevant building, or B is carried out in connection with a relevant change of use of a building, and Part B of Schedule 1 imposes a requirement in relation to the work. Point 2. The person carrying out the work shall give fire safety information to the responsible person not later than the date of completion of the work or the date of occupation of the building or extension, whichever is earlier. Point 3. In this regulation, fire safety information means information relating to the design and construction of the building or extension and the services, fittings and equipment provided in or in connection with the building or extension, which will assist the responsible person to operate and maintain the building or extension with reasonable safety. B. A relevant building is a building to which the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 applies or will apply after the completion of building work. C. A relevant change of use is a material change of use where after the change of use takes place, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 will apply or continue to apply to the building. And D. A responsible person has the meaning given in the Article 3 of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. So, Section 19, Fire Safety Information. Like with the consideration of the Volume 1 of the approved document that deals with dwellings, the requirement for information is universal throughout. Information is essential to allow for the safe operation, maintenance and assessment of the fire safety system of the property, understanding of the fire strategy, and to carry out an effective fire risk assessment. The amount of information needed depends on the complexity and height of the building, but generally is concerned in essential information for all buildings falling under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 and enhanced for higher risk buildings. So which building fall under this consideration? Basically all buildings but the individual private dwellings. So an individual house or an individual flat. If there are more than one interests or users in the building, the fire risk needs to be identified and managed. Responsibility for the safety assigned and everyone informed. I will not reiterate the list of aspects to consider. You can listen to this in the last part of the Volume 1 podcast or read in the document. So this is it, folks. Approved Document B, Volume 2, Fire Safety in Buildings Other than Dwellings, is now under your belt. This concludes the Approved Document B series, but let's recap this one. The requirement B3 concerning internal fire spread structure mandates that buildings be designed to maintain stability during a fire, resist fire spread between shed walls, and inhibit internal fire spread through compartmentation and suppression systems. This requirement ensures that buildings withstand fire long enough for safe evacuation and firefighting operations, emphasizing compartmentation, fire suppression systems, and control of fire spread within concealed spaces. Load-bearing elements of structure. Fire resistor requirements for structural elements are detailed in Appendix B. Elements essential for structural integrity are paramount. Single-story buildings generally don't need fire protection unless they support a compartment structure. Raised storage areas in single-story buildings might require additional protection. Walls and floors that separate buildings of different uses within a building must act as a compartment walls. Compartmentation generally extends throughout the entire height of the building or a full story. Special fire hazards require referee construction enclosures. Fire doors, protected shafts, and appropriate fire stopping measures must be integrated to restrict fire spread. Sprinklers are required for buildings with top stories over 30 meters above ground. Cavities. Cavity barriers are necessary to prevent fire spread through concealed spaces, with specific rules for large hidden spaces. Protection of openings and fire stopping deals with all things that go through the compartment walls and that needs to be fire stopped or sealed, with guidance that adhere to strict material and site guidelines. Car parks are either open-sided that require natural ventilation and closed-sided, which may need enhanced fire resistant and mechanical ventilation, and the installation need to adhere to standards like PS 1366, 12101 or 7346. External walls and roofs must resist fire spread considering the building's height, use and position. Regulation 7 mandates the use of appropriate materials and workmanship, ensuring external walls and attachments comply with fire safety classifications, except for specified exemptions. Buildings must be provided adequate access for fire appliances and firefighters, ensuring internal fire facilities, and ventilation for heat and smoke. Vehicle access, fire mains and hydrants must be planned according to specific guidelines, especially for buildings without fire mains or with extensive perimeters. Regulation 38 deals with relevant fire safety information that needs to be provided to the responsible person upon the completion or occupation of the building. This includes design and construction details and information necessary for safe operation and maintenance, particularly for buildings under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, which in the case of buildings other than dwellings will be all of them. In the next episode, we will move to the approved document C, site preparation and resistance to contaminants and moisture. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that the consideration of the approved document B, Fire Safety Volume 2, requirements are now more clear and comprehensible for you. You see, if you know a lot about the dwellings and flats, you pretty much know all the rest. If you have any question, reach out to me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm more than happy to help you out. In BitNow, we deal with planning, designing and managing all the projects, and we are always glad to facilitate a free initial consultation to steer you in the right direction. Visit www.bitnow.co.uk and reach out to us. Whether your question is if we can help you with your project or what should I do, we will be able to give you a piece of non-obligatory advice. At BitNow, we help our clients design and execute their dream homes or investments. If your building is falling apart, we can also help investigate the reasons behind it and to provide you with an appropriate strategy, design and specifications for the repair. Thank you again for listening. Please voice up your opinions. I'm waiting for you on LinkedIn and I want to hear from you. See you next week. Remember, BitNow designs the world around you. Toodaloo!